Welcome to this course, Montessori Applied to Children at Risk for Learning Differences. This course was developed by Dr. June Ford Shelton. She realized the importance of early intervention, and as a speech-language pathologist and a learning specialist and a Montessori-trained teacher, she combined much of the knowledge of these different fields to use Montessori curriculum, philosophy, and instruction specifically for children who were at risk for learning differences. During this course, we will cover many different areas, specifically what are learning differences and an overview of Montessori applied to children at risk. After the overview, we will go in depth on motor development, oral language development, the practical life, sensorial, oral language, written language, mathematics, and the cultural subjects. The first section of the course is an overview of learning differences. The term learning differences is used at Shelton because we feel it is more accurate in describing the particular challenges of the students that we work with. They do not have to have disabilities if they are presented with an educational strategies that meet their particular needs. So we will describe visual and auditory processing dysfunctions and how combinations of these dysfunctions, and in addition in many students, attentional problems affect learning, and how we can match our educational presentations to their specific needs. This morning we're going to talk about learning differences and what they are. And the learning difference that is the most frequently seen is dyslexia. Dyslexia is a scientific word that means literally difficulty with words. Difficulty, lexia, words. And so it's a very specific kind of reading difficulty, but it's not rare. And then we're going to talk about related disorders. Reading is not a natural process. It must be taught. Now, there are people like John Goodman, who created the whole language approach, who think that individuals could learn to read naturally, like they learn to speak. Nobody teaches a child how to speak, is his point. But I would tell him, as a speech-language pathologist, that yes, we do teach children to speak. Because if we did not have the model for them, then they would not be speaking. Most of you, I'm sure, know about the wild boy of Avignon, who was discovered running through the woods, and he had no language but a series of grunts like an animal, because he had not been exposed to language. So a hearing child is being able to hear language even in the womb, and certainly from birth until most children say their first word about a year of age, some later, some earlier. They're exposed to language. And that model and our correction of it, as parents say, the words and the directions and try to clarify for children, we are their teachers for learning to speak. But reading is something different. With speech and language, there are areas of the brain, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, two areas in the left hemisphere of the brain, that are specifically for understanding language and expressing language. So we have specific brain areas for the development of speech and language. But there are no specific brain areas for reading. Reading is a relatively new skill in the history of man. And so what happens in our brain that I'm going to be talking about this morning is that the brain is using the spoken language areas and some of the other areas of the brain to process letters and sounds into words, and words into sentences and paragraphs, etc. So from the point of view of a speech-language pathologist or a reading therapist, children need to be taught the important facets of reading. They need to be taught what those little squiggles are called, the names of the letters. They need to be taught what sound they make. They need to be shown how to blend those sounds together and actually decode a word and then put meaning to it. They need to be shown how to blend those words into reading of sentences and paragraphs and little stories. Some children that I've worked with over the years seem to learn to read without any instruction. And so I've had 3-year-olds that have come into the preschool already reading. And when I talk to their parents about, well, did you work with him on this? Well, no, not really. Well, do you read to him a lot? Oh, yes, I've read to him since he was a baby. Does he have older brothers and sisters who read or who are already in school? The answer is usually yes. So here this child has been exposed to language consistently since an infant. And because I think there's a very strong visual and auditory processing system, they have been able to pick up the code of the language without direct instruction. But in my experience, that's only about 1% of the population that is actually really reading that early. Most children need some type of instruction. And with that, you'll see them start to pick up the letters, the sounds, the ability to blend and begin to decode words at 4, at 5. Some children struggle for years, even into adolescence, and adulthood, to be able to do this thing called decoding, breaking words down and sounding them out. And in my experience, those are the children who are dyslexic, whose visual and auditory processing systems are not consistently processing the information, these abstract, arbitrary squiggles, into words. So the more the child has difficulty, the more explicit and direct the instruction of reading needs to be. So what do we learn with? We learn with our brain. Our brain has at least 100 billion nerve cells. 100 billion nerve cells. And it has between 5,000 and 50,000 connections between the neurons in the brain, the nerves in the brain. And so that's 1 million billion or a quadrillion connections between the neurons in our brain. It is so complex. It is more complex by more than we can understand than any computer that we've got. So whenever I read that about all these connections, I always have a thought. Do you have a thought about that? Do you?
It's just amazing.
Lucette? Amazing. Amazing, isn't it? And a thought that comes to me working with children with reading difficulties is, and why did we ever think all of those were going to work perfectly? And so they don't for any of us. We all make processing errors. But if they're not frequent, they're not a great bother to us. The research that's been done over the last 20 years definitively shows, this is research by the National Institutes of Health, that beginning readers need to be taught the code of the language. And that means the sounds that the letters make. So probably all of us have an area in which we're not able to do it maybe as great as other people can. So we all have these strengths and weaknesses. But when you have a learning difference, you are having so many of these dysfunctions going on consistently that it does affect your performance. And it pulls down your ability to work in school at the level of your intellect. So looking at the brain, we have the left and the right hemisphere. I think everybody knows that well. Here we go. And the left hemisphere processes language skills. Now, I'm oversimplifying. The left and the right hemisphere work together. Many areas of the brain work together, but some of the primary work of language is on the left side of our brain. On the right side, we process spatial information and abstract thought. We process shapes over here, primarily. We have some really important lobes in the brain. The occipital lobe, toward the back of the brain, interprets visual images. So we don't see with the eye. The eye is a receptor of the images that we see, whether it's a person or a word on a page. The information goes from the eye through the optic nerves behind the eye to this occipital lobe to be processed as what we're looking at. The temporal lobes here on the left side interpret auditory signals. So as we process auditory information, it's done primarily here on the left side of our brain. The parietal lobes up here at the top, bodily sensations. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Is this rough? Is it smooth? And the frontal lobes here behind our forehead, thinking, planning, creativity, primary motor area, coordinates other brain functions. I think of the frontal lobe as like a big switchboard in the brain that takes a lot of processed information from different areas and organizes it. That's where our executive functions are, putting together what we're processing and making sense of it. I mentioned earlier Broca's area. Broca's area is here in the frontal lobe, and it helps with speech production. So if I am able to say the sounds, this area of the brain is working, and I can express myself. Expressive language is being able to say what we're thinking. Wernicke's area is word processing and receptive language. So receptive language is our understanding. So in that first year of the baby's life, from birth to a year, they're hearing language, we said that earlier, and along the way, they start associating meaning with some of the words. We can say, let's go bye-bye. And a 9-month-old will look at his coat or look at our keys or get excited. We're going bye-bye. They're understanding, right? But they can't yet articulate, let's go bye-bye. So receptive language develops before expressive language. We understand the language when we hear it better than we can speak it. Think about Montessori's 3-period lesson. In her 3-period lesson, we say, this is. Then we ask, show me. That's receptive language. I'm naming it, you just show it. And the expressive language is, what is this? So what always amazes me about Montessori is all these different fields that she understood well enough to incorporate it into an educational method. The field of speech-language pathology was not even fully formed at the time that she was creating her method. And yet she knew enough about language to be able to incorporate the 3-period lesson into our instruction. Many of you have traveled or come from other countries. So, like experiences I have had when I first moved to Brazil, I could hear the language, and what I heard was what speech pathologists call prosody, the rhythm, the melody of the language. It has a particular sound, as does German and Spanish and French. They have different melodies and rhythms to them. So I could hear the rhythm, but I had no idea where the words were in that stream of sounds that were coming out of people's mouth, until slowly they would name something and touch it or hold it up, and I said, aha, a word. And until I started trying to study it. So the period that I was in for a while, that most of you have experienced in a new language and country, is I went to a period where I could understand what they were saying, but when I tried to retrieve the words, I didn't have them all yet. I hadn't made the vocabulary mine. So that's receptive and expressive language. There's an area up here in the brain, parietal temporal, that does word analysis, breaks words down. And an area back here, occipital temporal, that recognizes words without sounding them out. So after you see certain words over and over again, like and the and other sight words, you don't have to even attempt to sound them out. You just now know what those words are. Inside the brain is this area called the corpus callosum. It's not critical to know and remember its name, but it has a very important function. It takes messages from the left to the right side of the brain. And these messages dart back and forth very quickly when we're processing, or they do in the typical reader. So if you think back to the brain that I showed you earlier, the right side of the brain is perceiving the shapes of the letters, and the left side is putting sounds to those shapes. So the messages have to go back and forth for that information to be processed and then integrated. And the one thing that is, I think, the most important thing about understanding, processing, and learning differences is the glitch is in integrating visual and auditory information smoothly and easily and rapidly. Paula Talal at Rutgers University did some brain imaging with typical readers, people that didn't struggle to read, reading while she looked at their brains and what areas were lighting up. And how long did it take the typical reader to process a word? And she found it was 40 milliseconds. A millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. And when she did the same thing with dyslexic individuals, they were taking 400 milliseconds to decode a word. 10 times longer. So they make more errors than the typical reader, misprocessing more information, and they process more slowly. This does not mean they're a slow learner. There are students I've worked with IQs of 120, 130, 140, 150, brilliant people who are dyslexic. There is no correlation between IQ and your processing ability in reading. They're two entirely different things. And this is confusing to many people. Most teachers think that if a child is intelligent, they will learn. And when they're not learning in an area that simply doesn't make sense, this bright boy who can tell me more about dinosaurs than I'll ever know, or studies rocks and has a world of information about them, is reading like in the 5th grade with many, many errors and can't spell, and their written work looks like the work of a younger child. Come on. You're a smart kid. You can do this. You're unmotivated. You're not trying. You're lazy. And that's the way it looks to somebody who doesn't understand processing and how we learn. Because it seems like a contradiction in terms to say that we have a child with a high IQ who cannot read, unless you understand dyslexia. The brain works on chemical energy and electrical energy. So here's a list of the chemicals, the neurotransmitters that are in our brain that have to release for us to do most everything we do. It's not important to memorize their names, but it is important to understand this is how our brain is working. Acetylcholine is widespread in the brain. It's involved in muscle action, learning, and memory. And learning and memory are enhanced with muscle action. And so if this chemical is not releasing appropriately in the right amount, in the right sequence in the brain, you may have a child with real difficulty with working memory. Dopamine plays a major role in the regulation of movements and emotions. Can you think of a condition that a person might have if there wasn't enough dopamine being released into the brain? There are connections with depression, so with mood or emotions. There also are connections with a physical condition, Parkinson's. So if there's not the appropriate amount of dopamine, then the tremors are there. Now, if you can sit there and not have tremors, then the dopamine is releasing into your body in a normal way and allowing you to hold still. I often tell parents whose children are ADHD, do you think somebody with Parkinson's would rather not be doing this all over the body? Well, your child with ADHD would rather not be impulsive and getting in trouble all the time. But some of these chemicals are not releasing appropriately for him. Norepinephrine is particularly one. It's involved in reward, mood regulation, arousal, activation, and fight or flight behavior. So particularly important here in connection with ADHD is arousal. So sometimes these children are in a classroom, and in a traditional classroom where somebody is talking, and they have to sit and look and listen and not have much movement, they just kind of space out into the ozone layer. Sometimes their eyes can be right on you, but they're not back there. So the brain has not turned on its attention and focused it, let alone sustain it through the directions for whatever's coming next in the classroom. Serotonin regulates body temperature, pain perception, and the onset of sleep. And we know that a lot of our children with learning differences, and particularly those with ADHD, have difficulty with sleep. Some have a lot of trouble getting to sleep. And they finally do, but go into a very light sleep and stay there all night long. How many of you have ever had a night where you felt like, I never went to sleep? Well, we actually did. It was just such a light sleep, it wasn't restful. And then there are other children that finally go to sleep and they go into the deep sleep and stay there all night long. So instead of cycling, as most of us do, from lighter to deeper sleep all night long, these children are like down here, boom. And they're very hard to wake up in the morning. And it's very hard for them to begin to function, and they don't want to eat because they're still half asleep. And one of the things that often helps them is to give them some kind of juice when you first wake them up, so you can get the digestive juices flowing and some of the neurotransmitters starting to release. But many bedwetters are those very deep sleepers because they don't arouse enough to know it's time to get up and go to the bathroom. Endorphins minimize pain, produce feelings of pleasure,